behalf God's strategy, behalf God's strategies, behalf God's covert strategy, behalf God's covert strategies, behalf God's overt strategy, behalf God's overt strategies, behalf God's indirect strategy, behalf God's indirect strategies, behalf God's direct strategy, behalf God's direct strategies, behalf God's soft strategy, behalf God's soft strategies, behalf God's firm strategy, behalf God's firm strategies, behalf God's hard strategy, behalf God's hard strategies, behalf God's beginning strategy, behalf God's beginning strategies, behalf God's middling strategy, behalf God's middling strategies, behalf God's ending strategy, behalf God's ending strategies, behalf God's private strategy, behalf God's private strategies, behalf God's public strategy, behalf God's public strategies, behalf God's silent strategy, behalf God's silent strategies, behalf God's written strategy, behalf God's written strategies, behalf God's photo strategy, behalf God's photo strategies, behalf God's audio strategy, behalf God's audio strategies, behalf God's video strategy, behalf God's video strategies, behalf God's past strategy, behalf God's past strategies, behalf God's present strategy, behalf God's present strategies, behalf God's future strategy, behalf God's future strategies,